way I design my legislative package each year is based off of a couple of things. One, it's based off of how do we defend individual liberty, and the way I see to do that is by protecting property rights, by protecting essential civil liberties, by making it easier to get a job, run your business, etc. That means lowering taxes, lowering regulations. These are the general things that I always use when I take into putting together the bills I'm going to carry. However, when you've had 2 years of a Democrat-controlled legislature and governor's mansion, you end up having a lot of laws that go into place that the only way you can get rid of them is with a bill. So I'm going to be submitting a lot of bills to essentially repeal things that happened over the last 2 years. Now, one of those things, right off the bat, that I want to talk about was the Virginia Clean Energy Act. Now, the Democrat argument for all this is essentially say that climate change is an existential threat to the country. It's something that we have to deal with right now if we ever want to have a prayer of being able to solve it. And so passing things like the Virginia Clean Energy Act, which essentially tied Virginia emission standards to California. It required so much in solar energy, so much in wind energy. It had a moratorium on fossil fuels at a certain date within Virginia. All those things, right? It was very wide sweeping. It was one of the most wide sweeping, quote unquote, clean energy bills to pass in the country. All right. So Virginia went from a place that was pretty, middle of the road or relatively conservative with respect to our energy policy. Right. It was kind of like all hands on deck to nope, we're going to be California. We did that like almost overnight. So here was some of the fine print that was in that bill that the media didn't really talk about and that the Democrats certainly didn't talk about when they passed it. And that was the average household energy bill was going to increase by about $800 a month. Right? Yeah, they didn't advertise that part, but that's the reality. And now that we're going into a pretty cold winter, we've already seen a lot of snow drop in Virginia. $800 in addition, that was $800 just on average. But then when you have an increasingly cold winter, that price tag goes up. Right? But there's more, right? Because some people on the left will come in and say, well, this is just the price of saving the planet, right? You'd spend $800 a year if it meant saving your house or saving your world, so then why can't you do it? Here is the interesting part. When they were talking about all these solar projects, this wasn't something where they were going to take solar panels and just, put them on more buildings or more schools or more government property in order to increase the amount of solar that we got within the system. This wasn't something where they were simply going to incentivize you to put up individual solar panels. No, they created a system where literally we had to clear cut thousands of acres of forest. We had to rip up farmland in order to put in industrial solar fields, right? They call them solar farms. They're not farms, they're industrial solar fields. And they did this initially with so much speed and so much haste that what was happening was the government was giving a ton of money to companies that would essentially come in, convince a farmer to rip up their property, rip up their crops, put in solar panels. And initially, they didn't even have proper bonding. It's not like they had proper research with respect to what was going to happen to the soil long term, what the longevity was of the particular solar fields they were putting up. I mean, there was all kinds of problems with this. So the same people on the left that were driving around with, bumper stickers that say farmland lost is lost forever, were also the ones saying, yeah, rip it up and put in a bunch of solar fields. So there was a lot of environmental problems with this as well. So here's what I would say to people on the left. Right, because Blue Virginia's already come out and said that I have a pro-global warming bill, which, first of all, I'm a little bit shocked they keep saying global warming. I thought they got the memo that it's climate change now because it's easy to prove that the climate changes. All right, but they said this is a pro-global warming bill. I want everyone to understand where I'm coming from when it comes to green energy. The reason I'm getting rid of the Virginia Clean Energy Act, or something essentially going to make the attempt at it, is because it was horrible policy. And it wasn't just horrible policy for ratepayers when it comes to actually trying to heat your house in the winter time, right? It wasn't just horrible policy from that basic economic standpoint. It was horrible policy, in my opinion, from a green energy side. And look, I support, solar technology. I support, renewable technology. I think all of that is incredibly interesting. I think you look at some of the things that the private sector is doing right now with solar power, and it's very, very intriguing. However, if the only way that you can get to where you want to go is by destroying thousands of acres of forest and farmland, I'm going to say that maybe there might be something a little bit off with your environmental friendly energy plan. Not to mention the fact, and I've gone over this before, but when the government gets in the business of deciding winners and losers within the energy industry, what ends up happening is politicians end up giving billions of your tax dollars to companies that inevitably support their political campaigns. So you create this perverse incentive now where instead of green energy developing along market lines based off of what customers are actually demanding, it's developing based off of what politicians dictate. And those politicians have motivations which go beyond just saving the planet. right? So the whole idea of getting rid of the Virginia Clean Energy Act is not because we're against clean energy. It's not because we're against renewables. We're not against any of that. It's about saying that this was a badly conceived bill that was based more off of making headlines than it was about actually understanding how it would affect our environment here in Virginia, which, by the way, agriculture is our number 1 industry in Virginia. You're going to rip up all kinds of farmland. And then on top of that, creating perverse incentives which have actually pervert the way that green energy develops. All right, the way that green energy is going to be successful is by allowing it to compete within the marketplace and find those niches where it's going to be the most effective. Because when they're focusing their time, effort, and research and development into the products that customers actually want, it allows them to come up with new technology. It allows them to adapt things and actually to be effective within the marketplace. And then it also allows them to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And then they expand that because they're constantly having to develop to meet consumer demand, not to get subsidies from the government that can simply hand out other people's money without any real consideration long term for whether or not this is the best course of action. Right? So that is why I'm carrying the bill to repeal the Virginia Clean Energy Act. It was bad on a number of levels. Again, I'm not anti-clean energy. I just think that it has to develop within the marketplace if we want it to be sustainable long term and we want it to be the most effective. And I'll just give you one more example before I move on to my next bill. I want you to imagine if the government said, you know what, it's really important that everyone be able to effectively communicate, and so therefore the government is going to essentially take over and heavily subsidize and heavily direct, right? Not just subsidize, but direct cell phone communications, right? It's going to determine what your smartphone looks like, what apps it can carry, what sort of materials need to be used, what sort of technology needs to be present. Do you think we would have actually winded up with a better smartphone with that sort of government approach as opposed to an approach which had a lot more free market interaction and people able to compete with one another in order to produce the best product possible? I think the free market does a better job, 99 times out of 100 for any sort of issue or challenge that we're trying to face. I think we'll do a better job too with green energy, but the only way we can do that is we have to allow it to be able to develop. We can't try to micromanage and control it from the government. All right, so that's repeal the Virginia Clean Energy Act. All right, another bill I want to talk about, constitutional carry.